Chances are you remember where you were when prosecutors released the verdicts about Michael Brown and Eric Garner. When grand juries cleared police of wrongdoing in their deaths, the nation responded with protests, finger-pointing, and questions. I'm State of the Reunion host Al Letson. Tonight, we are building on the conversation with a town hall about race and justice here in Jacksonville. We want First Coast residents to hear the perspective of others in their community. If we can all understand each other a little better, maybe we can be the starting point for change. Good evening, and welcome to Race in the River City. We've gathered a couple hundred people here in the WJCT studios to have a real conversation about some of the most difficult and painful issues facing our city and our nation today. We plan to have a respectful discussion this evening and encourage everyone in the studio and those watching at home to truly listen and be open to hearing views other than your own. Questions about race and justice have haunted this country from its inception. And last year, the deaths of Michael Brown and Eric Garner and the grand jury decisions in those cases ripped open an ugly wound. We saw protests nationwide. In Florida, we're no stranger to these issues. In recent years, we've witnessed the deaths of Trayvon Martin and Jordan Davis and watched as criminal trials brought to light how race plays into our perceptions. After Ferguson, I was scrolling through my Facebook feed and I saw a parallel world being played out. On one side, I had friends who weren't thinking anything about what was going on in the rest of the world. And on the other side, I had a lot of friends who were really upset. And that caused me to sit down and start writing and really reflecting on where we are as a country today, which has led us here today to have this open conversation. So we've got members from the community here, and we'd like to hear their voices, and we'd like to hear your voice as well. So we'd like to start off with Mr. Wells Todd of the Jacksonville Progressive Coalition. Mr. Todd, talk to us a little bit about how your organization has been supporting the protests and exactly what is it that the protesters are trying to say?
Well, I'd like to change wheels here. The protesters, what we're saying and what protesters are saying is that there is what we know is true in America, and that is we're still dealing with institutionalized racism. And this is a fact. And when I speak, I want people to understand that I'm not attacking anyone. This is not a situation that you're responsible for. This is something that came about when Africans were brought here. It moved on to the Civil War. And after the Civil War, we had black codes that were instituted. We had those black codes turned into law. Many of you who lived in the South knew what that was like. And those laws lasted until the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s. But we have seen that racism in America is embedded within the very fiber of our society. So what we're seeing happening across the country is a resurgence of a movement that was destabilized with the assassination of Dr. King. What I mean by that is there is some unfinished work when it comes to civil rights, when it comes to human rights. We have a situation in America now, and I think because of social media, we are getting firsthand the attacks in the African American community by the police in cases, by vigilantes in other cases. And we have to begin to deal with what it is, okay, that we have to do to cut this cancer out of our society.
Thank you. Does anybody have any comments, any thoughts about what was just said? What about institutional racism? What do you think of when you hear that term? Anybody?
Prison population. My name's Emily Reeves.
And the question I asked was institutional racism. Like, what does that bring to mind for you? And you said?
Prison populations.
Why would that be?
Because African Americans are statistically arrested and convicted for crimes at a much higher rate than white people who have been well, white people are normally not even arrested a lot of times, especially when you think about the war on drugs. a white person that's pulled over and has a joint in their car, or a white person that smokes a joint or has an ounce of cocaine or something, they a lot of times can afford a higher priced lawyer, or they're given leniency, or they're given probation. But especially in poor communities, African American communities, the way that institutional racism works is to put that person in jail instead of put them in rehab or to give them a slap on the wrist, which is what happens with white people. And that's not necessarily the white people's fault, like what he was saying, the Progressive Coalition. It's the institutionalized, the way that the system works, to see a black man with drugs and to think that man needs to go to jail, and to see a white man or young man with drugs and to say, well, he just needs another chance, he just messed up.
Does anybody disagree with that? We have some, can we go to Mr. Green over here?
Hi, my name is Keith Green. I don't agree that institutional racism is something that's new. Institutional racism was enshrined in the Constitution with the 3/5 clause. It extends as far back as the Constitution. It existed in the Jim Crow laws. It existed in the federal government with giving just loans to white veterans as opposed to all veterans. It existed, if you read Michelle Alexander's book, The New Jim Crow, it shows how it's been pervasive in the justice system. If you look at the housing collapse, if you look at the Great Recession, it existed in the mortgage industry where minorities were put in subprime loans even though they had great or decent credit. Institutional racism has always been a part of this country. A few years ago, I was having an argument with a talk show host on another local program, and he told me that there was no such thing as institutional racism. So institutional racism is something, if you look for it, it's there. You don't have to look very far, but a lot of people are in denial about its very existence.
Thank you. How do we challenge that then? If you know, majority of us here can come to a conclusion that institutional racism exists, how do we go out and challenge something that basically by its definition is rooted in the base of what America is today? Can you state your name?
Yes, my name is Ebony Payne English. In reference to changing the institutionalized racism, we, social capital, we are the people of this country. We are the citizens of this country. We are the institution. The only reason that it's been able to prevail is because we've been satisfied or content with the conditions of our freedom here. And some of the conditions of our freedom is capitalism, predatory capitalism, and institutionalized racism. And that's just a fact. The economy feeds off of these principles. And so as long as there's an elite few who are able to make lots of money based on these principles and the economy is functioning somewhat, we can go and ignore them or pretend that they don't exist and continue until things progress to what they are now. The cauldron is now hot. And so now here we are having this conversation when this has been going on, as he stated, since the very beginning. But because the economy has been functional in this, it's been able to be ignored. Now, when things are a little tighter, when situations are not just in the black communities, and white communities, homes are being foreclosed on, people are being denied loans that are affluent, and that's happening, then now this is something that we want to talk about. Let's talk about what's wrong with the institution. But it's up to us to decide that this is enough and we're changing it. So.
Thank you. Do you want me to hand her the mic? There you go.
My name is Brooke Stevens. I'm a retired writer and financial analyst who spent 40 years in Wall Street in New York, but I grew up here, so I'm well aware of exactly what racism is here. It doesn't have to start in the prisons. We don't need to go there. Let's start with corporate America. Let's start with the politics of this country. And the reason things are is the way they are is because none of you actually stand up and ask the question, why is it like this? The question alone, especially coming from somebody white, would do a heck of a lot to break down what we have accepted things as they are. As she said, the only reason we're addressing it now is because somebody besides black people are hurting.
Can you state your name?
My name is Mayra Martello, and probably I'm the only Hispanic here. So the first thing I would like to say is the issue of race in this country is not only about black and white. We have many other diverse populations that are not taken into account. I've been living in this country for 10 years, and one of the things that when I came here, I thought, well, this is, the dream, the most wonderful country in the world because minorities are protected. And one of the things that has been shocking to me is to see that, yes, indeed, you have many laws that you can use to protect yourself. But the fact that you have to have those laws just really reflects that you don't respect those diversities. So part of my job is, in the way I try to fight racism, is just really to be aware of the fact that I have my own preconceptions about if you're Hispanic, or if you're black, or if you are white, this is what you can achieve. So those are the things that I think we should start like questioning ourselves. Is it okay that I think when I came to this country, the first thing I was told is, watch out with the black people, they don't like Hispanics. And watch out with the north side. You know, that's what people just repeat until you take the time to say, why is that? When was the last time that you have been to the north side? Have you been robbed there? So it's taking the time sometimes to question our own preconceptions and expectations about others.
Sure, thank you. I want to go over to Pastor Michael Smith from the Church of Jacksonville. Pastor, do you have any thoughts on what was just being said?
Yeah, I think the lady here, the question is why, and we don't ask why. It's just kind of, I think this gentleman here started off, it's in the fabric of American soil, it's part of our story. And I think maybe to get to the end and reverse engineer, I think we talk about progress, but we maybe haven't even defined what that would look like. What would it look like to finish the work of Dr. King? What would it look like? If, you know, I saw when President Obama was elected, there was all these stickers and Facebook and everything. Well, Dr. King's dream is finally here. And I just kind of, you know, shook my head. The former Secretary of Education under President Clinton said, well, that's it, you know, on election night, there's no more racism in America. And I don't even think, the reason I say that is, if we don't even understand the question, how are we going to know when we have the answer? Mm-hmm. And so we have to fast forward, what should it look like? And I think defining those things will help us come backwards. Take a snapshot of American poverty and say, well, what should it look like? Take a snapshot of prison, take a snapshot of education, take a snapshot of, you know, all these HIV, AIDS, arrest rates, et cetera. What should it look like? And then why is it not there? It's a broad statement, but my conclusion is this: everyone falls into one of two camps. And speaking, you know, red, yellow, brown, black, white, across a spectrum, primarily we deal with our history in this country to the people that lived here when we got here and to the people we imported in. You know, that seems to be where things are most revealing about our cultural hypocrisy. But I would say this, we talk about it in a red, yellow, black, brown, white context, but in the black and white context, where are we trying to get to? What are we saying? And I think it comes to, if 1/5 of our population is of one group, that should be 1/5 of prison. That should be 1/5 of dropouts. That should be 1/5 of poverty. But as long as there's overrepresentation of one group continually for generations in these broken societal issues, we have to ask why. The long story or short of it is, you're in one of two groups. You believe there's something wrong with them, or there's something wrong with us. And no matter how you slice it, there's either something about the soil of America, cultural expectations, definitions, and norms that is corrupt, and you got to go back to the head springs to find out why it's wrong, or there's some core deficiency in black folks. And people don't say they believe that, but most of television, most of conversation is, well, if they took care of their kids, if they, you know, were around, if they didn't do this, if they didn't do that, which speaks, most people think, well, I believe there's a core dysfunction in them. Nobody asks why. Why? And ethnicity is not rebukable. Only mindset is. And so we want to come into a group of people and say, you know, if they would do this, it would change. But you can't rebuke people. You don't have a group of people that have a big enough broom. You can rebuke mindset. And so challenging where those mindsets are, who shaped those cultural waters, who gives us our definitions. If we don't ask those questions, we won't even know where we're going, let alone how to get there.
Thank you. Do you have any comments from the audience?
One of the things we need to look at is how the cycle of poverty works in the African American community, in the brown community, in the poor white community. We have a prosecutor here, and she's doing the same thing that prosecutors are doing across the country, Angela Corey. Now, she has prosecuted more teenagers, African American teenagers, as adults than any other prosecutor in the state of Florida. So what happens when that happens? Okay, you take a child out of school, you prosecute him as an adult, you send him off to a private institution, private prison. The statistics prove that that child will not finish high school. The statistics prove that child will never get a job above minimum wage. So when we step in and criminalize our youth, what we're doing is, and what she is doing, is perpetuating the cycle of poverty. It disrupts that youth, it disrupts the family, and it disrupts the community. And this is one thing that the Jacksonville Progressive Coalition has mounted a campaign on. We want her removed from office. But it goes deeper than Angela Corey. Since President Nixon launched his war on crime and on drugs, all these wars that are mounted, the African American community knows what that means. We know full well what that means. What has happened is laws have been legislated that disproportionately send minorities off to prison for longer and longer periods.
Can I stop you right there? Hold on one second. Just hold on to that thought. I just wanted to ask, because what he said specifically, I think that a lot of African American people in this audience would totally agree with, would say that, like, when you say war on crime, to black ears, that means war on the black community in a lot of different ways. And I'm wondering if the white people in the audience feel the same way. I know this is like, please, like, the only way we can begin to have a conversation is all of us being honest and just talking. Like, there's no judgment here, but we can't talk unless we actually talk. So I'm asking, you know, the white people in the audience, do you hear the same thing? Because what he just said, that's what I hear. And I'm curious, do you all hear that? No. She's shaking. Can I get a mic over here?
Can I have you give your name? Jesse Wilson.
Mm-hmm.
I think this is, you know, growing up, you know how I did, I think this is something that's very new to me and something that I've come to realize over the past few years. But something I struggle with a lot of people that I grew up with and friends and interactions on social media is, unfortunately, a lot of people think it's something that's defeated. And something you said earlier that I really, really struck me is, you know, we have unfinished business. So, you know, where I've started to realize that maybe there is a war here. How do I convince other people? You know, how do I convince my peers that I've grown up with, my peers in this city of that? Is the struggle that I'm having.
I think that, you know, and I'll let other people answer as well, but I think that I would go back to what Pastor Mike said earlier, because it's something that, like, I think about all the time, which is either you believe that there's something wrong with black people at the core, or you believe that there's something wrong with the system. And I think that we just really need to have honest conversations with people and say that, because ultimately what you're saying when you say those people is you're saying that there's something wrong with black people inherently. And if you believe in the, what was it, the book that came out, the bell curve or something, if you believe in that bunk science, then there's not much I can do to talk to you. But if you don't believe that, then we need to, like, start tracing it back and looking at, like, where that starts. I want to go to Nancy here with One Jacks. Nancy, can you talk a little bit? I mean, like, what is your thoughts about all this?
So I was struck by some of the comments that you made, and what I hear with white ears when I hear war on drugs or whatever, I probably heard that at face value at first, but as I've become more aware, you've got to look deeper and look at the data, and you see who is impacted by these policies, who is impacted by the war on drugs. And when you see such a disproportionate percentage of African Americans who are affected negatively by that, then you have to question. I think this is why structural racism, institutional racism, is so insidious in our country, because it's hard to detect, it's almost invisible. And you have to question these disparities and look for the root causes. And when you look for the root causes, they're there. And some of the things that are really in our past and somewhat not in our consciousness, look at the placement of interstates in America. You look at that, that disrupted and tore apart disproportionately poor or African American neighborhoods all over this country. That's a piece of structural racism that we aren't even conscious of, but it disrupted lives and neighborhoods and communities. So some of these policies that we have come to grow up with and accepted as the way life is, if you accept that and you don't look deeper, why does it matter what zip code you live in, whether you have access to high quality education? That is not acceptable, and so we have to question these things, and I think until we look deeper under the surface, we don't see it.
I'd like to come over to Brenda Priestley-Jackson. Brenda, you worked, you got a lot, okay. You worked with the school board for a long time. Can you talk to us a little bit about how you see that playing out in education?
One of the structures of racism would be the desegregation of Duval County Public Schools. So when that happened, what schools got closed in what communities? Overwhelmingly the black community, okay? Where did the teachers that got dispersed throughout the city come from? Overwhelmingly the black schools, and for two reasons. One, we had an accreditation issue, and more of the teachers in the black schools had advanced degrees. We needed to spread them out over Duval County. What was the impact to the community that they left? They lost that resource, okay? Fast forward, so the community is feeling some type of way because you closed our schools. You kept other schools open, but you closed our schools. I mean, we say a school is a bedrock of a community. Right. You know, it's the center of a community. Fast forward 20, 30 years later, we go back to court, we go back to challenge desegregation. What's the first condition of the order that we impose? The ratio of teachers in schools again, that says it's supposed to be 70%, 30%. So once again, we displace overwhelmingly black teachers from the schools that they'd been in for a while. And that has a direct correlation to the quality of education, not because a black teacher is superior to a white teacher, but there is a community connection. It's integral for a young person to be able to see themselves in their teacher and the teacher to see themselves in that young person and have high expectations. And so I think incidental or related to all of that, when we talk about the criminal justice system, I think it starts with the education system. I think we prepare in this country two groups. We prepare a group of those to be governed and those that are the governors. And I think it plays itself out here in Duval County Public Schools. I mean, let's be honest. We have top-rated schools and we have bottom-tier schools. We have one tax base. Yeah. And so our criteria to get into various schools, when Nancy Brown and I were on the board, we actually looked at and understood that in certain schools, certain courses weren't offered. So we could say we didn't have admission criteria, but we really did if we didn't offer the school. So I think that if we begin to address that, if we have that mindset that first, we need to have more young people in this room, they should be here first. Because they're a generation that thinks they are post-racial, and that's black, white, brown, and any other group. They think they truly are post-racial. So they have to have the conversation, because they just kind of woke up like this. Really. They did. They did. Okay, so again, going back, I think, to education and looking at where we are right now, so if we have a disproportionate impact of the graduation rate, the literacy rate of certain groups, unless you go back to what the minister said and said you inherently believe that one group is inferior, and my God didn't create any inferior people. Unless you go back to that, then you've got to look at the systemic structures that are in place that continue to perpetuate it, because that's what happens.
Thank you. I'd like to open it up to the audience a little bit, and I'd really like to hear from, hold on one second, I'd really like to hear from some white people in the audience. Forgive me for putting you on the spot, but the only way we can challenge perceptions and talk about things is if you ask. Yes, ma'am.
Hi. My name's Kathy Esland, and there's so much we could say, so much I could say, and I think two of the most important things that I want to say are, number one, Caucasians have to recognize that white privilege exists. People who do not believe that, I encourage them to just please be open-minded about it and think about it.
I think that the term white privilege, I was recently at this convening of journalists from all over the country put on by the Aspen Institute. And what some of the white people in the room were saying is that the term automatically makes them go on the defensive because it says to them that they have not worked for the things that they have gotten in their life. And we talked a lot about, should we, as journalists, should we be using that term? Because like some people read it and automatically turn off. I'm of the belief of, yes, we should use the term.
Yes, and I'll tell you why.
Yes, please do. Yes, I would prefer to hear why you think we should than I.
Well, I mean, there's multiple reasons, but I think one of the most striking reasons is you yourself cited an example of incidents with your father, with you, with your son, where you felt threatened. Your very life was threatened by the crime of being black, okay? This is something that African Americans live with all the time. It lives in your bones, as I understand it, okay? My family does not have that issue. I do not fear for my children's lives because of their race. I do not fear for my life. I do not fear for my ancestors' lives because of their race. If that's not white privilege, I don't know what is. It's a lot bigger than that, but that's a starting point. It exists, and yes, you should use it.
Thank you. Anybody, any other thoughts? Yes?
Stanley Scott with the African American Economic Recovery Think Tank. I'd like to go back to the education part first before I address white privilege. When it comes to education, there's two types of education. And we talk about school education all the time, but there's life education that begins at the home. You know, no matter what school teaches you, you can still put value in your child by teaching them yourself. You know, what I'm finding out here when it comes to education, the miseducation of the white folks, white people, is what's most devastated than the miseducation of the Negro. And the reason why I say that, because whites are not privileged to the information that's available in this country about the great things African Americans have done. Africans was here before, almost 10,000 years before any white folks arrived in this country. We have done, it was the Africans that taught white folks how to eat off the land, the Pilgrims, not the Indians. So we have a miseducation here on the white folks side of town, side of the syndrome that is affecting us more in this country more. And we don't talk about that, the miseducation of white people, because a lot of them, when they come talking about the white privilege here, they are in denial about that. They are aware of it too, because they play a very big part. But what we found out here through the information, through research, is race is not about color. It's more about economics than anything else, and it always has been. Before America became America, it's always been about economics.
I'd like to go over to Sheriff's Office, Tony Davis. Tony, can you talk to us about some of the ways that, well, first of all, if you just have any general comments, but I also wanted to hear about some of the ways that the JSO is trying to reach out and you know, address these issues.
Hey, thank you. First of all, I have to go back to Ms. Jackson. I do agree. When we talk about education, that is the basis. You know, we talk about crime prevention and reduction. It starts with education. The sheriff, all of us believe it's much cost effective, it's much beneficial to everyone involved for someone to be educated as opposed to incarcerated. You know, the studies have proven the financial impact has been proven. So we'd much rather see more education that will lead to a lot of the other issues that, hey, we're experiencing. Reduction in crime, you know, gaining more knowledge. To the question that the young lady over here had, when it comes to blacks and whites being disproportionately arrested for drug offenses, I was a narcotics investigator and supervisor for 6 years. We put numerous white people in jail for narcotics, and not just the joint, but I'm talking about major narcotics trafficking in organizations. When they were arrested, when they went into the court system, it was, you know, if they could afford a lawyer or a private lawyer, then that was, you know, that was their opportunity.
I don't want to disagree with you on like whether or not you've arrested white folks for it, because I'm sure you have, but I would say that the way those defendants get treated statistically, it shows that like African Americans are far more likely to be charged for a serious crime opposed to a white defendant that's in, which I know like after you've arrested them, that's kind of out of your purview, but I'm just saying that like when it gets into the justice system away from actually being arrested, that's when we see the disparities come in place.
I wouldn't agree with that, and I don't agree with that, because I have seen where white defendants have been charged with substantial crimes, and they face significant amounts of time, as blacks have too. So that's not the case when whites enter the criminal justice system.
I would agree with you as far as like what you've seen, yeah. but I would say like when we look at like the national numbers, it leans in that other direction.
And I understand your question when you talk about the national numbers, and when you talk about that, I think that lends to being more involved. We're talking about policies and laws. That comes to being more involved and more active. We often talk about, hey, our voice is that vote. So, when we talk about, hey, addressing those issues, we have to address those issues that way. In regard to the question here, I have an African-American son. I've never been afraid for his life, as some people have reported. Yeah, they're dangerous. And I know some of the conversation we hear, they're people that are teaching their kids, you have to be fearful of law enforcement if you're black. Never told my son or my daughter or my nephews, you need to be fearful of law enforcement because you're black or you're African American. I understand, hey, there have been some issues, there have been some situations around the country, but I explained to them, you should be respectful in all encounters, in school, in public, wherever. So, and I've been in law enforcement 29 years.
Let me take, because I hear a lot of talking over here.
Respectfully say you're in a unique position, because as the mother of 2 African-American sons, one who's 22 is with me and another one that's 17, I cautioned them immediately when they started driving that if they had any engagement with the police to immediately call me. Tell them, I'm calling my mom, who happens to be an attorney, and my story is not unique. My story is not unique. Ironically enough, my older daughter, who is my height, I told her the same thing because, believe it or not, I have been profiled because I'm tall. And so when you see me in the car, you thought that I was a man. And I had a police come up to the car and say, oh, wow, it's you. You're surprised and I'm surprised, right? And so that's a life-saving measure, because in a young person's mind, when they're stopped by the police, I have not done anything, so you shouldn't bother me. So they're going to mouth off like any other teenager, but black males are not afforded the luxury of mouthing off because the consequences are too high. And so I would just share that that's not the lived experience of many of us. So, yeah.
Well, I have to disagree. My wife is 6'2", my daughter is 6 foot, my son is 6'10". So my wife has been stopped. They don't know that she's, married to a law enforcement officer. My son has been stopped, no issue. There again, I'm not saying that, hey, there haven't been issues. I'm not going to stand here and say that. What I am saying, the issues that, hey, are being reported and conveyed, I think if you go back and you look at those circumstances, I think you will find there's some other issues in regards to those.
I want to get Mr. Alton Yates over here. You've been an activist in this community for a long time. Can you give us a long view of this?
I wish I could. I wish I understood the long view, and I often thought that I did. But normally when I get in situations such as this and hear the broad disconnect between the way life really is and the way some people think it is, I have to wonder whether I know what the long view is. I have a son who is 52 years old now, but he has a certain profile. And when my son visits my home, every evening when he leaves, I tell him, be careful, drive carefully, don't exceed the speed limit. This is a grown man that I'm talking to. But he's short, and he fits a certain profile, and I know that if he got into any kind of trouble at all, it's not going to be just another individual who's in trouble. It's going to be a young, well, he looks young. It's going to be a young black male. And that's unfortunate. I had the opportunity to work in crime prevention for the Jacksonville Sheriff's Office for a number of years. And in making presentation to community groups, we always struggled to get young people to attend the sessions. What we were looking for, we were trying to get young men and young women from the lower economic social group to attend some of these sessions because it seemed as though that's where the majority of the problems were. Unfortunately, we couldn't do that, so we worked with what we had. And what we found was that when you bring the police who patrol certain neighborhoods together with people who live in those neighborhoods and then have them sit down and talk about the problems that exist there, then they begin to understand that there are some problems that are inherently terrible in the black community that the white community never experiences. But when we talk to low-income whites, they will say that the kinds of problems that we as black parents are encountering with our children are no different from what they are encountering with theirs. So I thought I understood the long view. I don't think I do. But I think what has to happen is that we have to continue to try to bring people together from both of those communities so that they can understand that we do have a lot more in common than there is that separates us. And if we could simply get together and talk about some of the problems we face, then perhaps as black parents, we wouldn't have to be so cautious when our children leave home.
I would say, and this is just a question, and I know that you can't answer for the whole JSO or for all the police officers throughout the United States. But I believe in hearing you speak, and I think Alton said it really well, that there is a disconnect between the experiences that you've had as a police officer, as a black man being a police officer, and definitely the experiences that I've had. I can tell you that, like, and it's in the blog post that I've been writing, I can tell you that, like, I have had a conversation with my son. I have had that fear in my heart that something was going to happen to my child. My dad had that fear in his heart that something was going to happen to me. And I mean, no disrespect when I tell you that, like, it's different, my experience is different from yours. But I think that, you know, in order for us to bridge this gap, we need more people in uniform listening to what people who are not in uniform have to say about how it goes, and then we begin to find a path together, because no matter what happens, like, we have to find a path together. Like, that's all there is to it. There is no, the police officers can do their thing and we can do our thing. That's just not possible. Like, we all have to live in this planet together. So we have to find a way to be able, for you to be able to communicate your truth to me be able to communicate my truth to you, and us find a place in the middle where we can all start to move forward. Because I gotta tell you, and please stand. Yeah. I gotta tell you that, like, if my son calls me today and he gets pulled over by a police officer, I am filled with fear. I tell you, like, my son called me one day, he was in Hemming Plaza, he was shooting a video, he's a video kid, he loves shooting videos. Just down there shooting a video. A cop told him he couldn't do it. He packed up. I know my son is respectful. I've taught him that, like, not just with police officers, but with anybody, be respectful. And there are people in here that know my son and they can attest to it. He packed up his stuff, and the cop kept coming at him, kept egging him on, and grabbed him and said, "I want you to read this sign," when he's just packing up to go. And it made him mad. Like, he's 22 years old, and he's easy, you know, like, when I was 22, I would get mad quick too. And then he called me, thank God, and I told him to shut up, pack his stuff, and go. And then I got in my car, and I drove to Hemming Plaza, and the whole time I'm driving, I get choked up thinking about it. The whole time I'm driving, I can feel my heart in my chest. I just beating. And maybe I'm not worried that he is going to be killed. I am, but especially with all the stuff that's going on today. But also I'm worried that he's going to get charged for something and end up in the criminal justice system and not be able to get a way out. You know, and so, like, it's a real concern for me, and I think that Brenda spoke to it, and from what I heard all over here, it's a concern.
And I understand that, and you know, what you're talking about is communication. And for law enforcement officers to get to understand and get to know the people in the communities that they work in, I'm a big proponent of that. We have to. If you work a certain area or certain community, it's incumbent upon you to get to know the people in that community. to know what issues concern them, to know the challenges. You do that by talking to them. We in the Sheriff's Department, we do a series of what we call knock-in talks, where we don't have any cameras, we don't take the media, but we go into communities and we knock on doors and we talk firsthand to the residents and just ask them, hey, what are the concerns that you have? I do a series of those myself. People say, well, people won't talk to the police. No, they talk. And from those conversations and those meetings, I've had several people continue to call me often, but it's about communication, getting in there. You have to get to understand and know the community that you work in. It's important if you want to be successful and if you want to bridge that gap. And that's how we dispel any of those rumors or those myths, or hey, we determine, hey, this is an issue. What can we do together to work on that issue? And that's what the Sheriff's Office and that's what the Sheriff promotes.
Can you say us and give us your name, please?
Hi, good evening. I'm Shavara Oren, and I have to say, you are the first black man that I have ever heard say anything like that. My heart is racing even listening to you. I'm new to the city. I've been here a couple of years, and a few months ago, our house alarm went off, and my husband called me to tell me that the alarm had gone off, and I live in historic Springfield, and the first thing I thought wasn't that someone might be in my home stealing 7 flat-screen televisions or expensive art. I was thinking that my son William, who's also 22, was out running, and he runs in the morning sometimes with headsets, and what I was thinking is if William happened to be running back in and ran into the house or was in the house and coming out, that the officers in historic Springfield certainly wouldn't think that he belonged in the house that we live in. And I am speeding from downtown, and I am racing home, and I am crying, and I'm trying to reach William on the phone, and he's not answering his phone. And when I get there before the officers get there and before William gets there, and I just fall to the ground, and I'm sobbing. And I'm sobbing primarily because I have to feel that way in America and in Jacksonville. And when William came home and I was talking to him about it, he looked at me and he held my hands and he said, Mom, you've been telling me this since I was 2. I'm fine. I've got it. But just like you, Alton, I am compelled every time he leaves the house. I'm concerned that his tint on his Honda is too dark. And he says, Mom, we live in Florida and the sun is hot and I need tint on my windows and you have tint too. I'm really just amazed. And I think you're right, Al. There is an incredible disconnect. But to your point, I also have made it a point to take him around and introduce him to officers in my neighborhood. I find them and I say, this is William and he belongs at this house. I need you to know what he looks like. When I was rushing home that day, I called 911 to give them a description of him, to say that if officers arrive at my house because they were called about this alarm, that this is what this young man looks like, and I need you to be careful not to harm him or shoot him or think that he doesn't belong there. So I don't know if I'm glad that this is your experience. I'm really baffled and surprised, but I do know that we have incredible disconnect in our community, and I think that those in power have to really be responsible, whether that's white allyship, whether that's officers who really do hold power and control in communities, to make that first step and to come out and be supportive of the community that we live in.
We have to be, but to the same point, when my son leaves my house or he's traveling, I tell him, hey, be careful. But not from the standpoint you need to be careful because I'm afraid that someone in law enforcement is going to confront you or harm you. Tell you need to be careful because there are people out, and we all know, and we can pretend like they're not, but there are people out in the community, black, white, brown, that look to take advantage of anyone. So if we're going to have a conversation, we have to be open and honest about the other things that occur in our communities. The experiences and some of the unfortunate experiences that people have had with law enforcement, it is unfortunate. We work on that by having a conversation.
Hi, my name's Joel Mangum. I'm a big fan of Al, by the way.
Thank you.
But
got good taste.
Thanks, bud. I just want to say the one thing I'm not hearing represented is the story that we're allowing my generation to enact. Like, I can vouch that I don't want to say I'm the youngest one. I mean, I can see a few other people, but I'm in my early 20s, and this is a conversation that my demographic's not having right now. And to vouch for JSO, y'all have monthly meetings. There's 5 meetings for all parts of towns for people to go to, and I show up to those meetings, and I'd be surprised that the normal attendance age is 65 plus. I mean, it's crazy that only our older citizens care about our community. When I love Jacksonville, I think it's the best city to live in. I love the River City, but I'm really concerned about the stories that we're enacting into my generation, because I have friends of all walks of life. I mean, it's insane. I grew up in the generation where same-sex marriage is legal now. I mean, we don't face the same trials and tribulations that our parents did, and luckily they were there to fight these trials and tribulations for us. But we can have an open discussion like we're having now. And some of the things that frighten me is to hear that a young African-American child, like you said, Brenda, can't look up to a white professor or a white teacher and see themselves in them. I mean, we're one community. We should look, if we want to get diverse, we should be Jacksonville. We should care about that man. That is a teacher from Jacksonville. That is a Jacksonian professor.
Let me pause you there and just ask you to think about it from this vantage point, respectfully.
Yes, sir.
You have been brought up in a country where all the people that you see, or not all the people, but most of the people that you see that are doing great things in the community are white people. Or if you, for example, I heard someone say that something about how black folks only vote for black people. I've rarely had the opportunity to vote for black people, so I think I've been voting for white people a long time. So I would just say that, like, when you look at it from that perspective, most of the people that we see moving in a certain direction or doing things in our community, they are white. And when you're a young white kid, it's probably a lot easier if you see an African-American man doing things to think that, like, yeah, you can see the aspirational side of it. But when you are a young black kid and you don't see it reflected in you, that's a problem.
I'm John Meeks. I look at this as unfinished business. It's been nearly a half a century since consolidation had created a bold new city of the South from Jacksonville and Duval County, and of course the beaches in Baldwin. There was great promise in the late 1960s before consolidation, and I know the black community has been asked to sacrifice for the greater good when it came to closing down black schools to integrate the district, when it came to consolidating. We were on the cusp of being a majority black city, like Baltimore or Atlanta or Detroit or Washington, D.C. But the city's leaders said, okay, we'll take care of all communities. But we've seen otherwise over the years in drainage and roads and infrastructure and parks and services that many people in many sectors of the city take for granted. And they see those problems as another side of town. Well, I ask you, is that one city that we're talking about? That we talk about crime being on one side of the river, or a lack of services being on one side of the river, or other people's children not being educated the proper way. That does not sound like the dream of consolidation, in my opinion. For us to truly rise to the occasion and to finish that unfinished business, we have to realize that promise of a true, bold new city of the South for Jacksonville, Florida.
Thank you. Can we get right here?
So one of the things that I found really interesting and challenging, I'm a native of Jacksonville. I do believe strongly that white privilege exists, and I have certainly benefited from that. And I found it really interesting over the last year or two that as a white woman trying to raise my voice up, not because I've had the same experiences that my black friends and their family members have had, but because I care deeply about this community, I care deeply about my friends and my colleagues, that when that voice often gets raised, whether it's me saying I can't breathe or me saying Black Lives Matter, that becomes a very surprisingly complicated stance. It's one in which my black friends often say, that's not yours to say, which I do appreciate. And my white friends say, how dare you? Actually, all lives matter. Which I think was a very interesting part of the conversation. The whole issue of all lives matter, well, that's a given. And I found it offensive that for some reason a lot of people found it inappropriate to put a spotlight on the issue that right now we need to be talking about the fact that Black Lives Matter. So I think as we talk about white allyship and a real authentic empathy and engagement in this conversation. We have to find ways where the way we talk, the way we share passion and compassion can be accepted. And I think we've seen some difficulty in being able to do that sort of across the board and throughout the community.
I would agree that it's complicated. I mean, I think the one thing that white people should know is that there is no black president of the of black folks. Al Sharpton does not represent black folks. He really doesn't represent me. So when it comes to having conversations of race and who people telling you that, African Americans telling you that you shouldn't say Black Lives Matter, I appreciate you saying Black Lives Matter because I feel like the only way for us to really begin the conversation is because, I mean, let's just be honest, when African Americans say these type of things, it's very easy for people to brush it off and to just say, well, they're just upset and it'll go away. But when white folks join their voice to it, then absolutely. I think that this is the tricky thing. I think that, when we're talking about LGBT rights and those type of things, it's a tricky thing being an ally and understanding kind of where your place should be. And your place probably should not be leading, but definitely adding your voice to the chorus, because your voice added to the chorus makes it so much stronger. We all have to come together to be able to sing and for people to actually hear it, But it is a question of where do we all fit in? And those are tricky questions that we are all kind of tiptoeing through and trying to understand, which, ultimately this conversation is really all about. So yes, I take your point and I totally understand that it is a tricky thing, but I would say to you, from me, as your friend, you saying all Black Lives Matter is important to me. I put a hashtag all Black Lives Matter, and someone responded to me that all lives matter, and I say yes, all lives do matter. The point that I'm trying to make is that in this country, my life is not valued as much as all lives do. So right now, I need you to hear me that Black lives, brown lives, they matter. They matter. And this country gets really uneasy with that idea because America is very comfortable in the idea of being comfortable. America wants to be comfortable. I went to Ferguson and I went there maybe a week or two after the first incidences of violence happened in Ferguson. And I learned a lot of things. One of the things that I learned in Ferguson is I went to Ferguson and I thought that what I was going to find out is that the people of Ferguson were just tired, that they had had enough, that they had seen, Jordan Davis, they'd seen Trayvon Martin, they'd seen all these different things, and they were just tired of it. And when I got to Ferguson, not one single person said that at all. Every single person said to me it was the blood. It was the blood. That boy was shot on the street, and they didn't put a cover on him, and they let him sit in the August sun for hours. And his blood poured down from his body all the way down, and people could watch the blood. And every single person I talked to that saw it, that's what they said. It was the blood. Normally we don't see the blood. We didn't see the blood with Eric Garner. We don't see the blood. So it's like when they saw it, it got them upset. But I say that to say that I talked to a pastor there in Ferguson, and I asked her well, she told me, I didn't ask her. She said that she was walking by these other reporters, and these other reporters saw that she had this sign on that said clergy, and they were like, oh, you're going to make it peaceful. And she said, no, I'm here to disrupt the peace. I'm here to shake it up because Americans are too comfortable. We don't want to have these tough conversations. And it's okay in having these tough conversations if we disagree, if we don't see the same thing. It's okay. But that's where the conversation needs to start, is where we disagree. We're going to take one last question all the way in the back here.
I'm Savannah Lenoble, and I'm in 6th grade. And just to comment on the police, my dad knows a lot of policemen, and I've been at luncheons where he's talked to them about the Ferguson, and I've been taught not to be afraid. But my friends at school, they'll talk about it and they'll say how afraid they are that something's going to happen to them, especially my really close friends that are black. And it's pretty upsetting that something in the news can affect us like pretty much across the country, and we shouldn't have to be able to live in fear.
Thank you. This hour and a half that we've spent in this room together, we are not going to heal the racial rifts of this country. It's just not going to happen. You know, in order for Jacksonville to become the bold new city of the South, that all of us, we have to be bold. Not just in preaching to the choir, but preaching outside the choir. I feel like in order for the conversation to keep going, like white people, like you gotta talk to other white people who don't necessarily agree. Black folks, like we have to start having the conversations with ourselves and with others as well. But we have to do it from a place of understanding and love, and sometimes that takes a lot of patience. I think one of the biggest disservice that we've done to the civil rights movement is we've pared it down to one man in one speech. It was, I have a dream. That's it. And if it's, I have a dream and that's it, then it makes it easy for everybody. All we got to do is march to Washington. It's all good. We don't ever talk about the work that the NAACP did. We don't ever talk about what the students did. We don't ever talk about what the Urban League did. We don't talk about all these different organizations, the Children's Commission, like how all of them worked to make this happen. Like it's not just one path, it's many paths. But that means all of us have to roll up our sleeves and get our hands dirty.